Marcus Chen had always believed that first contact would happen in a laboratory, with scientists in white coats and diplomats in expensive suits carefully orchestrating humanity's introduction to alien life. He never imagined it would happen while he was bleeding out in a crashed escape pod on a planet whose name he didn't know, watching beings that looked like living glass surround him with weapons drawn. The mining expedition to Kepler 442b had been routine until the solar flare hit. Marcus had been the chief engineer aboard the cargo vessel Prometheus, responsible for maintaining the atmospheric processes that would prepare the planet for terraforming. When the electromagnetic pulse fried their ship's systems, he had barely managed to reach an escape pod before the vessel broke apart in the planet's atmosphere. Now, 12 hours after the crash, he found himself face to face with creatures that defied every assumption humanity had made about alien life. They stood nearly 8 feet tall, their bodies appearing to be carved from translucent crystal that caught and refracted light in impossible ways. Their movements were fluid, almost liquid, and when they communicated, it was through harmonic frequencies that made his teeth ache. Marcus raised his hand slowly, the universal gesture of surrender, though he wasn't sure these beings would understand it. His environmental suit was damaged, and he could feel the alien atmosphere seeping in through the tears in the fabric. The air was breathable, thankfully, but it carried scents he couldn't identify and made his skin tingle with an electric sensation. The lead crystal being approached him, and Marcus could see intelligence in what he assumed were its eyes. Faceted gems that seemed to hold depths of light within them. When it spoke, the sound was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. But somehow, impossibly, Marcus began to understand fragments of meaning. "Why do you bring fire from the sky?" the being asked, its voice resonating directly in Marcus's mind rather than through his ears. Marcus struggled to formulate a response. How could he explain human expansion, the need for resources, the drive to explore and colonize? Instead, he focused on the immediate situation. "My ship was damaged. I came here by accident. I mean no harm." The crystal beings exchanged harmonic communications too rapid and complex for Marcus to follow. He noticed that their skin changed color subtly as they spoke, shifting from clear crystal to pale blue, then to deep amber. It seemed to be some form of emotional expression. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the lead being approached him again. This time when it spoke, Marcus could understand it more clearly, as if his brain was learning to interpret their communication method in real time. "You are not like the others who came before. They brought weapons and took our people. You brought only tools for building. Others?" Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Had there been other human contact with this world? The expedition briefings had indicated this was a completely unexplored planet, uninhabited according to all their surveys. "What others?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice calm and non-threatening. The being's crystalline form shifted to a deep red, and Marcus instinctively knew this indicated anger or distress. "The hunters. They came in great ships, took many of our young, and disappeared into the void. We thought you were more of them." Marcus felt a growing understanding dawn on him. Slave traders. It wasn't uncommon in the outer systems, where law enforcement was thin and profit margins were high. Some unscrupulous humans had clearly discovered this world before the official expedition and had exploited its inhabitants. "I'm not one of them," Marcus said firmly. "My people don't all think the same way. Some of us believe in helping others, not hurting them." The crystal being studied him for a long moment, and Marcus felt an odd sensation, as if his thoughts were being gently probed.
It wasn't invasive or uncomfortable, more like someone reading his emotions than his specific thoughts.
"Your heart light shows truth," the being said finally. "I am called Zarafel, and I speak for the Valdris in this region. You will come with us, and we will decide what to do with you." Marcus nodded and struggled to his feet, wincing as pain shot through his left leg. He hadn't realized how badly he'd been injured in the crash. Zarathal noticed his distress immediately and made a series of harmonic sounds to the other Valdris. Two of them approached and, without being asked, positioned themselves on either side of Marcus to help support his weight. Their touch was surprising, warm despite their crystal appearance, and it seemed to ease some of his pain. As they began to move through what Marcus now realized was a city, he marveled at the architecture around him. The Valdris had grown their buildings rather than constructed them, creating organic spirals of crystal that reached toward the sky like frozen music. Light moved through the structures in patterns that seemed almost alive, and Marcus realized this wasn't just artistic. It was functional, a form of communication network that connected the entire city. As they traveled, Marcus became aware that they were attracting attention. Valdres of all sizes emerged from buildings and pathways to observe him. Some displayed the red coloration he'd learned indicated distress or anger, but others showed curious blues and greens. Children, at least, he assumed they were children based on their smaller size, peeked out from behind adults with bright, rapidly shifting colors that reminded him of excited chatter. "Your people fear me," Marcus observed as they walked. "Not fear," Zarathel corrected. "Caution and hope. There are prophecies among our people, old songs that speak of allies who will come from the stars to help us in our darkest hour. Some believe you might be the beginning of that prophecy's fulfillment." "What kind of prophecy?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Zarathel was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus noticed that the other Valdres around them had also fallen silent, their colors dimming to muted shades. When Zarathel finally spoke, there was a weight to the words that made Marcus's chest tighten. "The song speaks of a time when the eternal darkness will return, when the devourers of light will come to consume all that we are. In that time, the Star-Touched will stand with us, and together we will either save all worlds or watch them fall into endless night." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the alien atmosphere. "The eternal darkness? What is that?" "We hope it is only legend," Zarathel replied. But the fearful amber that rippled across the Valdres' skin suggested otherwise. "But the signs are gathering. The harvesters have returned to our system after 1,000 cycles of absence. Our sister worlds have gone silent one by one. And now, a star-touched falls from the sky just as our most sacred site begins to sing with warning songs." They had reached what appeared to be the center of the city, a massive crystal spire that rose impossibly high into the atmosphere. At its base was an opening that seemed to pulse with its own inner light, and Marcus could hear something that made his bones vibrate, a deep thrumming note that felt both ancient and urgent. "The heart of Valdres," Zarathel explained. "It has been silent for 3,000 cycles. Yesterday, it began to sing. Today, you arrived." This cannot be coincidence. As they approached the spire, Marcus noticed that other Valdres were gathering, not just common citizens, but individuals whose crystal forms were more elaborate, more complex in their patterns. Leaders, he realized, or perhaps priests. Their colors were more controlled, more purposeful in their shifts. One of them, whose crystalline body contained what looked like flowing starlight, approached Zarathel and engaged in rapid harmonic communication. Marcus caught fragments, words about the confluence, the Queen's awakening, and the price of prophecy. When the conversation ended, Zarathel turned to Marcus with an expression that somehow conveyed both excitement and dread, despite the alien features. "Marcus Chen of the Star-Touched," Zarathel said formally. "You are to be brought before the Eternal Queen. She has awakened for the first time in 500 cycles, and she calls for you specifically." "She calls for me? How is that possible? She doesn't even know me." "The heart of Valdres spoke your name," the starlight-filled Valdres said, moving forward. "It spoke of your arrival, your purpose, and your choice. The Queen wishes to meet the one who will either save us all or watch us die." Marcus felt the weight of destiny settling around him like a heavy cloak. He thought of his simple life as an engineer, his plans for retirement to a quiet colony world, his dreams of a peaceful existence. All of that seemed very far away now. "And if I refuse?" The gathered Valdres exchanged harmonic tones, and Marcus sensed sadness rather than anger in their response. "Then the prophecy ends here," Zarathel said quietly, "and we face the eternal darkness alone." Marcus looked around at the faces, if they could be called faces, surrounding him. These beings had shown him kindness when they could have killed him. They had hoped when they could have despaired. And now they were asking him to be part of something larger than himself, something he didn't understand but couldn't ignore. "Take me to your queen," he said finally. The gathered Valdres brightened immediately, their colors shifting to brilliant golds and whites. The spire before them pulsed with renewed energy, and its opening dilated to reveal a passage that seemed to lead both inward and upward simultaneously. As they entered the heart of Valdres, Marcus felt the last of his old life slip away behind him. He was no longer just Marcus Chen, engineer. He was Marcus Chen, the Star-Touched, and whatever that meant, he was about to find out. The passage through the spire defied physics as Marcus understood it. They seemed to be walking on level ground, but he could feel them ascending, spiraling upward through the crystal structure. The walls around them pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that told stories he couldn't read but somehow felt in his bones. Tales of ancient wars, of love that transcended species, of sacrifices that echoed across time. As they climbed higher, the air itself seemed to change, becoming charged with potential energy that made his hair stand on end and his skin tingle. The Valdris around him were changing too, their colors becoming more vibrant, more complex, as if proximity to whatever lay ahead was enhancing their very beings. Finally, they emerged into a chamber that took Marcus's breath away. It was vast beyond comprehension, its ceiling lost in crystalline formations that captured and amplified light in impossible ways. At the center of the chamber, surrounded by what could only be described as a garden of living crystal, stood a figure that made Marcus's knees go weak with awe. The Eternal Queen was beautiful in a way that transcended species. Her crystalline form was more complex than any of the other Valdris, containing what looked like entire galaxies within its transparent depths. She stood nearly 10 feet tall, but her presence filled the chamber as if she were the size of a mountain. When she moved, it was with a grace that suggested she was dancing to music Marcus couldn't hear, and when she spoke, her voice was like the song of creation itself. "Marcus Chen," she said, and hearing his name in her voice made him feel as if he was being recognized by the universe itself. "You have come at last." Marcus found his voice, though it sounded small and rough in the vast chamber. "Your Majesty, I'm honored to meet you, though I'm not sure why I'm here." The Queen smiled, an expression that somehow translated across their vastly different biologies, and approached him. With each step, the crystal garden around her responded, flowers of living light blooming in her wake. "You are here because the universe has a sense of humor," she said, and Marcus was surprised to hear what sounded like gentle amusement in her voice. "It sends us heroes who do not know they are heroes, protectors who do not know what they will be called to protect." She gestured, and the air around them shimmered, showing images that Marcus realized were visions of possible futures. He saw great fleets of ships, darker than space itself, descending on worlds filled with light. He saw civilizations fleeing in terror as their suns were extinguished. He saw the Valdris and creatures like them making desperate last stands against an enemy that consumed not just life, but the very concept of existence itself. The eternal darkness is not a metaphor, Marcus Chen. It is a force that seeks to unmake all that is, to return the universe to the void that existed before creation. They are called the Umbral Collective, and they are coming here. Marcus stared at the visions, feeling a growing sense of horror and disbelief. "Why are you showing me this? What can I possibly do against something like that?"
"You can choose," the Queen said simply.
The prophecy speaks of a moment when a star-touched will stand at the crossroads between salvation and destruction. In that moment, their choice will determine not just the fate of one world, but the fate of all worlds. The visions shifted, and Marcus saw himself in scenarios he couldn't quite understand, standing against impossible odds, making sacrifices he couldn't imagine, becoming something more than human through sheer force of will and determination. "But why me?" he asked. "I'm just an engineer. I fix atmospheric processes and maintain life support systems. I'm not a warrior or a leader or anything special." The Queen moved closer, and Marcus felt the warmth of her presence wash over him like sunlight. "You are human," she said, as if that explained everything. "Your species has a quality that even we Valdris, with all our ancient wisdom, struggle to understand. You have the ability to care for others even when it costs you everything. You will fight for strangers, sacrifice for enemies, and stand against impossible odds, not because you believe you can win, but because you believe it is right." Marcus thought about that, remembering moments in his life when he'd made similar choices on a smaller scale, helping fellow crew members even when it meant extra work for him, standing up to bullies even when he was outnumbered, choosing the harder path because it was the right one. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "For now, nothing more than you have already done. You survived when you should have died. You chose peace when you could have chosen violence. You agreed to come here when you could have refused." The Queen's expression grew serious, her colors shifting to deeper, more solemn hues. "But the time of testing is coming, Marcus Chen. Soon you will be asked to make choices that will define not just who you are, but who humanity can become." The chamber around them began to pulse with a new rhythm, and Marcus could hear harmonics that sounded like warning bells. The Queen's expression shifted to one of immediate concern. "They come sooner than expected," she said, her voice carrying a note of urgency that made Marcus's heart race. "The Umbral Scouts have found our world. We have perhaps days before the full force arrives. Marcus felt everything he'd just learned crashing down on him. Days? You're telling me I have days to figure out how to save the universe? You have days to figure out how to save yourself, the Queen corrected. The universe can wait a little longer if you choose correctly. She moved to the edge of the chamber, where the crystal walls had become transparent, showing the city below. But first, you must survive what is coming. The Umbral do not simply destroy. They corrupt, they twist, they turn light into darkness. If you are to have any hope of fulfilling the prophecy, you must learn to resist their influence. How do I do that? The Queen turned back to him. And for the first time, Marcus saw something like hope in her ancient eyes. The same way your species has always survived impossible odds. You remember what you're fighting for, and you refuse to give up. As if summoned by her words, alarms began to sound throughout the city. Not the harsh mechanical alarms Marcus was used to, but harmonic warnings that seemed to come from the very air itself. Through the transparent walls, he could see the Valdris below moving with urgent purpose, their colors shifting to patterns he was beginning to recognize as preparation for battle.
It begins, the Queen said quietly.
Marcus Chen, will you stand with us? Marcus looked out at the city below, at the beings who had shown him kindness when they could have shown him hostility. He thought about the visions of darkness consuming everything, about the prophecy that somehow centered on him, about the choice he was being asked to make. He was scared. He was confused. He was completely out of his depth. But he was also human, and that, apparently, was going to have to be enough. Yes, he said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. I'll stand with you. The Queen smiled, and the light that emanated from her seemed to push back the shadows that were beginning to gather at the edges of the chamber. Then let us prepare for war, Marcus Chen. And let us hope that when the moment comes, you will be ready to take the arrows meant for others. The first sign that something was terribly wrong wasn't the alarms or the frantic activity of the Valdris. It was the silence. Marcus noticed it as Zarathel led him through the crystal corridors away from the Queen's chamber, a creeping absence of sound that seemed to eat away at the harmonious undertones that normally filled Valdris spaces. The birds, Zarathel said, stopping suddenly in one of the crystalline hallways. They've gone quiet. Marcus listened carefully and realized that the alien equivalent of birdsong, which had been a constant background melody since his arrival, had completely stopped. Even more unsettling, the very air seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. How long before they arrive? Marcus asked, checking the makeshift weapon that Zarathel had given him. A crystal resonator that could produce focused sound waves capable of shattering stone. It felt inadequate against an enemy that could extinguish suns. Unknown. The Umbral do not travel like other species. They move through spaces between spaces, arriving when reality is weakest. Zaratel's colors had shifted to a steady deep blue that Marcus was learning indicated focused concentration. The Queen believes we have hours at most. They emerged onto a balcony that overlooked the city's defensive preparations. Marcus was amazed at how quickly the Valdris had transformed their peaceful community into what appeared to be a fortress. Crystal spires had reconfigured themselves into weapon platforms, and the flowing organic architecture had reorganized into defensive barriers. The Valdris themselves had changed too. Their normally peaceful flowing movements had become sharp and purposeful, and their colors had shifted to the coordinated patterns of a military unit. Your people have done this before, Marcus observed. Many times, Zarathel confirmed grimly. We are one of the few species to have survived multiple Umbral incursions. We learnt long ago that the only way to fight the darkness is with light, coordination, and sacrifice. As if in response to those words, the sky above them began to change. What had been a clear alien afternoon with 2 suns shining down started to dim, as if clouds were gathering. But these weren't natural clouds. They moved with purpose, writhing and twisting against the light like living shadows. They come, Zarathel whispered, and the words were picked up and passed through the city in harmonic waves, until every Valdris knew that the moment of battle had arrived. Marcus watched in fascination and growing horror as the shadow clouds began to descend toward the planet's surface. As they got closer, he could see that they weren't clouds at all, but massive ships, or perhaps beings, that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They were shaped like enormous spear points, and where they passed, the very air seemed to become grey and lifeless. How do we fight something like that? Marcus asked, feeling the weight of his own inadequacy settling over him. Together, Zaratel said simply. And with everything we have. The first Umbral ship touched the planet's surface about 3 kilometers from the city, and the effect was immediate and nauseating. The ground around the landing site began to lose color, the vibrant alien vegetation turning gray and then black. The very air shimmered with a wrongness that made Marcus's teeth ache and his vision blur. From the landed ship came creatures that defied description. They weren't so much beings as they were mobile voids, spaces where existence seemed to have been scooped out and replaced with hungry darkness. They moved like liquid shadow but struck like solid matter, and where they touched, things simply stopped being what they were. The corruption spreads fast, Zarathel observed, watching the advancing gray zone through what appeared to be crystalline binoculars. We must stop them before they reach the city's heart, or all will be lost. The Valdris defense began immediately. Crystal weapon platforms throughout the city began to pulse with concentrated light, sending beams of pure energy toward the umbral creatures. Where the light touched them, the shadows writhed and pulled back, but they didn't seem to be truly damaged, merely inconvenienced. Light hurts them but doesn't destroy them, Marcus noted, watching the battle unfold. Correct. Light alone is not enough. It requires something more, something that we have never been able to provide. Zarathel turned to look at Marcus directly. But perhaps something that you can. Before Marcus could ask what that meant, the second wave began. More umbral ships descended. These ones smaller and faster than the first. They released swarms of creatures that looked like flying shadows with too many teeth, and these spread out in all directions, clearly intending to surround the city. We need to get to the defensive command center, Zarathel said urgently. The Queen will want to coordinate with you there. They made their way through corridors that were now filled with purposeful activity. Valdris warriors, Marcus hadn't even known such a caste existed, moved in formation toward defensive positions. Their crystal forms had taken on more angular, aggressive shapes, and they carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. The command center was a marvel of organic technology. The walls themselves served as display screens, showing tactical information in 3-dimensional light patterns that hung in the air like holographic sculptures. The Queen was at the center of it all. Her massive form connected to the city's defensive network through crystalline tendrils that pulsed with information. "Marcus," she said without turning around, somehow knowing he had arrived. "Come and see what we face."
The displays around him shifted to show a comprehensive view of the battle.
There were dozens of umbral ships now, with more arriving every minute. The corruption zone was spreading outward from each landing site like an infection, turning the vibrant alien landscape into a grey wasteland of non-existence. They're not just attacking, Marcus realized, studying the patterns. They're converting the entire planet. Yes, the Umbral do not simply conquer, they transform worlds into extensions of the void between spaces. If they succeed here, this planet will become a staging ground for attacks on surrounding systems. The Queen's colors shifted to patterns of deep concern, and eventually, a launching point for the invasion of your human territories. The weight of that statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't just about saving the Valdris. It was about protecting humanity from an enemy they didn't even know existed. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "For now, observe and learn. You cannot help us if you do not understand what you are truly fighting." The Queen gestured, and the displays zoomed in on one of the battle zones where Valdris warriors were engaging umbral creatures directly. Marcus watched in amazement and horror as the battle unfolded. The Valdris fought with coordinated precision, using their light-based weapons to drive back the shadows while supporting each other with harmonic communications that allowed them to move as one organism. But for every umbral creature they disabled, 2 more seemed to emerge from the growing darkness. "They're losing," Marcus said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "They are holding." The Queen corrected, "For now. But you are right that this strategy alone will not achieve victory. We can delay the inevitable, but we cannot prevent it." A new alarm began to sound, different from the others, higher-pitched and more urgent. The Queen's entire form flashed bright white for a moment, and Marcus felt a wave of fear pass through the room. "What is it?" he asked. "The harvest ship," Zarathel said, pointing to the main display where a new contact was appearing. "We had hoped they would not bring one so soon." The ship that was descending toward the planet's surface was larger than all the others combined, and its shape was different too, not a spear point but a massive sphere that seemed to bend space around itself. Where the other ships had merely absorbed light, this one seemed to be absorbing reality itself, creating a zone of distortion that hurt to look at directly. What does it do? Marcus asked, though he was afraid he already knew. It harvests, the Queen said simply. Not just life, not just matter, but the fundamental forces that hold existence together. If it completes its work here, this entire solar system will collapse into void. Marcus stared at the approaching ship, feeling the true scope of what they were facing for the first time. This wasn't a war in any sense he understood. It was an assault on the basic concept of existence itself. How long do we have? The harvest ship must establish itself and begin drawing power from the planet's core, perhaps 6 hours before the process becomes irreversible. The Queen turned to face him fully. Marcus Chen, the moment spoken of in prophecy, approaches far sooner than we expected. Soon, you will be asked to make a choice that will determine everything. Before Marcus could respond, another wave of alarms filled the command center. The displays shifted to show something that made his blood run cold. A breach in the city's outer defenses. A group of umbral creatures had broken through the light barriers and were moving rapidly toward the city center. They're coming for the heart, Zarathor said, colors shifting to urgent reds and yellows. If they corrupt the central spire, the entire defensive network will collapse. The Queen detached herself from the command center's connections with fluid grace. Then we must stop them. Marcus, you will come with me. It is time for you to see what it truly means to fight the darkness. They moved through the city with supernatural speed, the Queen's form flowing like liquid light while Marcus struggled to keep up despite the assistance of a mobility harness that Zarathil had provided. All around them, the city was transforming itself for war, crystal structures reconfiguring into weapons, harmonic networks shifting to carry tactical information, and civilian Voldris evacuating to protected areas deep within the spire. When they reached the outer defensive ring, Marcus got his first close look at the enemy. The umbral creatures were even more horrible up close than they had appeared from a distance. They weren't just dark, they were anti-light, spaces where photons went to die. Looking at them directly caused physical pain, and Marcus found himself having to focus on their general position rather than their actual forms. The Valdris defenders were putting up a heroic fight, but Marcus could see that they were being overwhelmed. For every beam of light they fired, the shadows seemed to grow thicker. For every creature they drove back, 3 more emerged from the darkness. They're not just fighting us, Marcus realized, watching the battle. They're feeding on our attacks. The energy we're putting out is making them stronger. The Queen's form brightened with what Marcus was learning to recognize as surprised approval. Yes, you see clearly for one so new to this war. Light alone is not enough. It must be light with purpose. Light with meaning behind it. What kind of meaning? The meaning that comes from choosing to stand against the darkness even when victory seems impossible. Being that comes from protecting others even when it costs you everything. The Queen moved forward toward the battle line, and Marcus followed, his heart pounding with fear and adrenaline. They reached the defensive position just as the line began to waver. The Valdris warriors were exhausted, their normally bright forms dimming with fatigue. Some had already been touched by the umbral corruption and were struggling against the grey emptiness that was spreading through their crystalline bodies. "Hold the line," the Queen commanded, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to strengthen every Valdris who heard it. "Remember what you fight for." But even as she spoke, Marcus could see that it wasn't enough. The umbral creatures were pressing forward, their void-like forms consuming the light-based barriers as fast as the Valdris could create them. In moments, they would break through entirely. That was when Marcus saw her. At the far end of the defensive line, isolated from the main group by a gap in the barriers, was a single Voldris warrior. She was smaller than the others, her crystalline form indicating youth, but she was fighting with desperate courage against a group of umbral creatures that had flanked the main force. Her light weapons were flickering with exhaustion, and Marcus could see that she wouldn't be able to hold them off much longer. "Who is that?" he asked Zarathel. "Lyriaven, the Queen's daughter and heir. She insisted on fighting with the warriors despite our protests." Zarathel's colors shifted to patterns of distress. "She is cut off. We cannot reach her before the shadows do." Marcus watched in horror as the umbral creatures closed in on the young Valdris. She was backing toward the edge of the defensive platform, her weapons failing, her light dimming. In moments, she would be overwhelmed. And that was when something inside Marcus snapped. He didn't think about prophecies or cosmic destiny or the fate of the universe. He just saw someone who needed help, someone who was about to die while others watched helplessly. His human instincts kicked in with a force that surprised even him. "Give me that," he said, grabbing a resonance weapon from a nearby Valdris. Without waiting for permission or explanation, he sprinted toward the gap in the defenses. "Marcus, no!" the Queen called after him. "You cannot survive direct contact with them." But Marcus was already moving, his engineer's mind automatically calculating angles and trajectories. He had spent years working in hazardous environments, and danger had always brought out a clarity of thought that served him well. This was no different, except that the hazard was creatures made of living void instead of radiation or vacuum. He reached the edge of the platform and, without hesitation, leaped across the gap. His human reflexes, evolved for a different gravity and atmospheric pressure, gave him just enough advantage to make the jump that a Valdris couldn't have managed. He landed hard next to the young Valdris, his resonance weapon already firing. The sound wave struck the nearest umbral creature and, to his surprise, seemed to have more effect than the light weapons had been having. The creature writhed and pulled back, its void form becoming less stable. "How?" Lyriavine asked, her harmonic voice filled with exhaustion and hope. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, firing again at another approaching shadow. "But I'm not letting them take you." What happened next became the subject of songs among the Valdris for generations to come. Marcus Chen, the star-touched engineer who had never fought a real battle in his life, stood against the creatures of the Umbral Collective with nothing but stubborn human determination and a weapon he barely understood how to use. But it wasn't the weapon that mattered. It was the fact that he had chosen to be there, had chosen to put himself between danger and someone who needed protection. That choice, that simple human instinct to protect others, somehow changed the fundamental equation of the battle. The umbral creatures that had been advancing with confidence suddenly began to hesitate. Their void forms flickered and became unstable. And when Marcus fired his weapon now, the sound waves carried something they hadn't before. The resonance of absolute determination. The frequency of someone who would rather die than let others be harmed. "Impossible," breathed the Queen, watching from across the gap. "He is turning their own nature against them." The shadows were retreating now, not from the weapon but from what Marcus represented, the antithesis of their existence. They were beings of emptiness, of the spaces between things, of the surrender to inevitable entropy. Marcus was the opposite, someone who built things, who created solutions, who refused to accept that anything was inevitable if you were willing to fight hard enough. But the effort was taking its toll. Marcus could feel something draining from him with each shot, some essential part of himself being consumed by the battle. His vision was beginning to blur, and his hands were shaking with more than just adrenaline. That was when the real test began. The umbral creatures regrouped and launched a coordinated assault, not just on Marcus and Lyravan, but on the entire defensive line. But this time, they had learned from their encounter with the human. They brought weapons. The arrows came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Projectiles of crystallized void that could penetrate any defense and corrupt anything they touched. They flew in perfect formation, dozens of them, aimed not at Marcus, but at the Valdris around him, at Lyriavan, who was standing right next to him, at the Queen, who was leading the countercharge across the gap. Time seemed to slow as Marcus saw the arrows approaching. He could calculate their trajectories, could see exactly where each one would strike. Most would miss, but 3 were perfectly aimed, one at Lyriavan's core, one at the Queen's heart, and one that would strike a critical structural point and bring down the entire defensive platform. In that moment, as the arrows flew through the air with deadly precision, Marcus understood what the prophecy had really meant. This was the moment of choice. Not some grand strategic decision, but the simple, terrible question of what he was willing to sacrifice to protect others. The arrows were already in flight. There was no time to warn anyone, no time to fire his weapon, no time for clever solutions or engineering fixes. There was only time to move. Marcus stepped forward into the path of the arrows, spreading his arms wide to intercept as many as possible. He felt the first one strike him in the shoulder, sending waves of cold emptiness through his body. The second hit his chest, and he felt parts of himself beginning to simply cease existing. The third took him in the leg, and he collapsed to his knees as void corruption spread through his system. But he had stopped them. All 3 arrows meant for others had found him instead. The last thing Marcus saw before the darkness took him was Lyriavine's face, her crystalline features radiating colors he had never seen before, the harmonic equivalent of gratitude, awe, and something that transcended species barriers entirely. The last thing he heard was the Queen's voice, carrying impossible harmonics of power and purpose. The prophecy begins to unfold. The star touched has shown us the way. As consciousness left him, Marcus felt something strange happening to his body. Instead of dying, instead of simply ceasing to exist as the void corruption consumed him, he felt himself changing, transforming, becoming something new. Something that could take arrows meant for alien queens and somehow survive to see what came next. Marcus awoke to the sound of singing. Not the mechanical alarms or tactical communications he remembered from the battle, but something far more beautiful. Harmonic frequencies that seemed to resonate with every cell in his body. As consciousness slowly returned, he realized that the singing wasn't coming from outside him, but from within. His own body was producing the crystalline melodies that filled the air around him. "He awakens," came a familiar voice. Zarathel was standing nearby, but there was something different about the Valdris's appearance. The usual flowing crystalline form was more stable, more defined, and the colors that played across the surface were deeper and more vibrant than Marcus remembered. "How long?" Marcus tried to say, but what came out was a harmonic tone that carried the question more clearly than words ever could. He sat up quickly, alarmed by the change, and looked down at his hands. They were no longer entirely human. His skin had taken on a translucent quality, with veins of light running beneath the surface like bioluminescent circuitry. His fingers were longer, more elegant, and when he moved them, traces of harmonic light followed the motion. He was still recognizably himself, but enhanced, transformed, evolved into something that bridged the gap between human and Valdris. "What happened to me?" he asked, this time managing to produce words alongside the harmonic undertones. "You died," the Queen's voice came from behind him, and Marcus turned to see her approaching with what could only be described as wonder in her ancient features. "The void arrows should have unmade you completely, scattered your essence across the spaces between atoms, but instead, you became something new." Marcus stood carefully, testing his transformed body. He felt stronger than before, more aware, as if his senses had been expanded beyond their normal limits. He could perceive electromagnetic fields, feel the gravitational pull of the planet's moons, hear conversations happening kilometers away. But beneath it all, he was still himself, still the engineer who had jumped into danger to save someone else. "The battle," he said urgently, memory flooding back. "The umbral forces, the Harvest ship. Retreated," Zarathel said, colors shifting to patterns that indicated amazement. "When you took the void arrows and survived, no, more than survived, transformed, something changed in the fundamental nature of the conflict. The umbral creatures began to malfunction." The Queen gestured, and the walls around them became transparent, showing Marcus the current state of the world outside. Where before there had been spreading zones of great corruption, now there were islands of brilliant light. The alien landscape was healing itself, color and life returning to areas that had been consumed by void. "I don't understand," Marcus said, though part of him was beginning to grasp something profound and terrifying about what had happened to him. "The umbral collective exists by consuming existence itself," the Queen explained, moving closer to study his transformed features. "They are entropy given form, the universal tendency toward dissolution and decay made manifest. But you, Marcus Chen, have become something they cannot comprehend, order arising from chaos, existence reasserting itself in the face of void." Marcus looked at his hands again, watching the patterns of light that moved beneath his transformed skin. "I've become some kind of antivirus for reality itself." "More than that," Zarathel said. "You have become proof that consciousness can transcend the limitations of its original form when motivated by something greater than survival. The Valdris have sung of such transformations in our oldest prophecies, but we had never seen one actually occur." The Queen moved to a crystal formation that served as both chair and communication device. "The umbral forces have withdrawn to reconsider their strategy. The Harvest ship has gone silent. Its corruption process is interrupted by the resonance you now generate. But this is only a reprieve, not a victory. They will return, and when they do, they will come prepared to face what you have become." Marcus absorbed this information, his enhanced mind processing implications at a speed that would have been impossible for his original human brain. "How long do we have? Days, perhaps weeks. The umbral do not retreat lightly, and when they return, they will bring forces designed specifically to counter your new nature." The Queen's colors shifted to patterns of concern. "But in that time, you can learn to use what you have become. And perhaps we can discover why the prophecies spoke of you specifically." Over the following days, Marcus began to understand the full scope of his transformation. he learnt that he could project fields of what the Valdres called existence enhancement, zones where reality became more stable, more resistant to entropy and decay. Plants grew faster in his presence, wounds healed more quickly, and even mechanical devices functioned more efficiently. But more importantly, he discovered that he could teach these abilities to others. "Watch," Marcus said to a group of Valdres warriors during a training session. He placed his hand on the crystal surface of their practice weapons, and the harmonic light that flowed through his transformed physiology began to spread into the crystalline matrix. Don't just fire light at your targets, fire intention. Fire the absolute certainty that existence is stronger than void. When the warriors fired their weapons with this new understanding, the results were dramatic. Instead of simply pushing back umbral test subjects, the enhanced light beams actually reversed the corruption process, restoring void-touched matter to its original state. "Incredible," breathed Lyriavane, who had become Marcus's most dedicated student. The young Valdres princess had insisted on participating in every training session, driven by a combination of gratitude for her rescue and genuine fascination with Marcus's abilities. "You are teaching us to fight entropy itself." "I'm teaching you what my species has always known instinctively," Marcus corrected. "That the universe tends toward order when conscious beings decide to make it so. Humans have been fighting entropy for millennia, building cities, curing diseases, creating art, refusing to accept that decay and dissolution are inevitable." The Queen observed these training sessions with growing interest. "Your species must be remarkable indeed to have developed such instincts without conscious awareness of their cosmic significance." Marcus thought about that during the quiet moments when he wasn't training warriors or studying his new abilities. Were humans really special in some fundamental way, or were they just fortunate enough to have evolved on a world where cooperation and determination were survival traits? The answer came to him during his first encounter with refugees from the other worlds the Umbral had attacked. The ships arrived without warning, a ragged fleet of vessels carrying survivors from a dozen different species, all fleeing the advancing darkness. Marcus was in the city's main plaza when they landed, and he watched in fascination as beings unlike anything he had imagined emerged from their damaged spacecraft. They were the Kethmori, crystalline beings like the Valdres, but more angular and mechanical in their movements. The Salandri, who appeared to be made of living metal that flowed like mercury. The massive Boruntai, whose rocky carapaces made them look like walking mountains. And dozens of other species, each unique, each carrying their own approaches to consciousness and civilization. But as Marcus moved among them, offering what comfort his presence could provide, he noticed something troubling. They were all afraid, not just of the Umbral, but of each other. Millennia of separate evolution had created beings so different that they could barely communicate, let alone cooperate. How do you coordinate a defense with allies who can't even agree on basic concepts like time and space? Marcus asked Zaratel as they watched a heated debate between refugees about evacuation protocols. "We do not," Zaratel admitted. "This is why the Umbral have been so successful. They attack each world separately, knowing that we cannot unite against them. Each species fights alone, and alone, we all fall eventually." Marcus watched the arguing refugees for a long moment, his enhanced perceptions picking up the harmonic frequencies of their distress and fear. Then, without really thinking about what he was doing, he began to sing. It wasn't a song in any conventional sense. It was a harmonic frequency that seemed to emerge from the light patterns flowing through his transformed body. The melody carried no words, but somehow it communicated concepts that transcended language. Safety, cooperation, hope, the possibility of unity despite difference. One by one, the arguing refugees began to quiet down. The Salandri stopped their rapid-fire metallic communications. The Borentai ceased their rumbling protests. The Kethmori's sharp, angular movements became more flowing and peaceful. And then, incredibly, they began to respond to Marcus's song with their own harmonics. The Valdres added their crystal chimes, the Salandri contributed flowing metal melodies, the Borentai provided deep bass undertones, and each of the other species added their own unique voices to the growing symphony. For the first time in recorded history, a dozen different alien species were creating music together. "Impossible," whispered the Queen, who had arrived to witness the phenomenon. "They should not be able to harmonize across such different evolutionary paths." But Marcus understood what was happening. His transformation hadn't just changed his body. It had made him into a kind of universal translator for consciousness itself. The light patterns that flowed through him carried the fundamental frequencies of existence, the basic harmonic structures that underlay all life, all awareness, all choice. "They can harmonize because consciousness is universal," he said, still maintaining the song that kept the refugees united. The specific forms are different, but the underlying pattern is the same. The choice to be aware, to care, to protect others, that's not human, it's not Valdris, it's not specific to any one species. It's what consciousness means. Over the following days, Marcus worked with the refugee fleet to establish something that had never existed before, a truly multi-species military alliance. Using his ability to facilitate communication between radically different forms of consciousness, he helped coordinate defense plans that took advantage of each species' unique capabilities. The Keth Mori's precise mathematical thinking made them perfect tactical coordinators. The Salandri's ability to reshape themselves made them ideal for reconnaissance and infiltration. The Boran Tai's massive strength and resistance to damage made them perfect heavy infantry. And the Valdris harmonic communication abilities made them natural command and control specialists. But it was the arrival of the second wave of refugees that really drove home the scope of what they were facing. Marcus, Zarathel said urgently, approaching him as he worked with a group of Salandri engineers on shield harmonics, "You need to see this." She led him to the orbital monitoring station, where displays showed the approach of another refugee fleet. But this one was different, larger, more organized and carrying what appeared to be entire populations, rather than just military survivors. They're not fleeing a battle, Marcus realized, studying the formation. They're fleeing complete system extinction. The lead ship established communication as soon as it entered range, and the message it carried sent chills through everyone who heard it. The Umbral hadn't just retreated to regroup, they had been systematically destroying entire star systems, consuming not just planets but the suns themselves, leaving nothing behind but void. 17 systems have gone dark in the past week, reported Gorthak, the massive Borantai who commanded the refugee fleet. The Umbral have changed their tactics. Instead of corrupting and converting worlds, they are simply unmaking them entirely. They appear to be preparing for something, some final assault that requires vast amounts of consumed reality. Marcus felt his transformed senses reaching out, trying to grasp the scope of the threat. 17 star systems, billions of lives, countless worlds, entire civilizations simply erased from existence as if they had never been. They're not just conquering, he said slowly, the horrible realization dawning on him. They're gathering power for something bigger. Something that requires the complete dissolution of multiple realities. The Queen's colors shifted to patterns Marcus had never seen before. Combinations of fear, determination, and ancient knowledge. The final unmaking, she said quietly. We had hoped it was only legend, but the signs match the oldest prophecies. They seek to undo the fundamental forces that hold the universe together. How do we stop something like that? According to the prophecies, the Queen said, her voice carrying harmonics of destiny and despair, the star-touched must journey to the heart of creation itself and choose between personal survival and universal salvation. But the prophecies also say that this choice will transform the star-touched into something that is no longer truly alive, no longer truly individual. Marcus looked around at the gathered refugees. Dozens of species, millions of individuals, all looking to him for hope he wasn't sure he could provide. Then he thought about the 17 star systems that had been erased, about the billions of lives that had been snuffed out as if they had never mattered. Where is the heart of creation? He asked. Zarathel exchanged harmonic communications with the Queen before answering. At the galactic core, where the first consciousness emerged from the primordial void. But Marcus, the journey itself is impossibly dangerous. The Umbral will be expecting us, and the closer we get to the heart, the more unstable reality itself becomes. How long before they complete their preparations for the final unmaking?
Unknown, the Queen admitted.
But each system they consume makes them stronger. We may have days, or we may have hours. Marcus felt the weight of impossible choice settling on his shoulders. Stay here and try to build defenses against an enemy that could unmake star systems, or undertake a journey that would almost certainly end in his death. Or worse, his transformation into something that was no longer truly him. But as he looked at the faces around him, Valdris, Salandri, Borintai, and dozens of other species all united by their refusal to surrender to entropy, he realized that the choice had already been made. It had been made the moment he stepped in front of those void arrows to protect Lyriaven. It had been made every time a human chose to build instead of destroy, to heal instead of harm, to stand together instead of falling apart. We go to the heart of creation, he said simply. All of us. If consciousness is universal, then the defense of consciousness must be universal too. The Queen's form brightened with something that transcended hope. Then let us prepare for the last journey, Marcus Chen, and let us hope that when we reach the heart, what you have become will be enough to tip the balance toward existence instead of void. As the combined fleets began preparations for the most dangerous journey in galactic history, Marcus felt his transformed consciousness reaching out across space and time, touching the edges of something vast and ancient and terrible. The Umbral Worm Collective was out there, consuming realities, gathering power for their final assault on the fundamental forces that made existence possible. But consciousness was out there too, countless species, countless individuals, all making the same choice that Marcus had made, to stand against the darkness, to protect what mattered, to refuse to accept that entropy was inevitable. The battle for the heart of creation was about to begin, and everything that had ever existed was going to hang in the balance. Marcus looked at his transformed hands, watched the patterns of light that flowed through his hybrid physiology, and felt something like peace settle over him. He had changed from human to something new, something that bridged species and realities. But at his core, he was still the engineer who fixed things, still the person who would rather die than let others be harmed. And that, he realized, might just be enough to save the universe, if he was willing to pay the price. The journey to the galactic core should have taken months, even with the fastest ships in the combined fleet. Instead, it took 3 days. Marcus stood on the bridge of the lead vessel, a hybrid ship that the Valdris had grown and the Silandriae had enhanced with their living metal technology. Watching space itself bend around them as they traveled through corridors of reality that shouldn't have existed. His transformation had given him more than enhanced senses and harmonic abilities. Somehow, his presence was making space more cooperative, more willing to fold in ways that brought distant points closer together. "The universe wants us to reach the heart," observed Cassandra, the Silandri navigator whose mercury-like form flowed through the ship's control systems like living circuitry. "I have never felt space respond this way to the presence of a single being." Marcus wasn't sure he liked the implications of that observation. Every ability he'd gained, every enhancement to his consciousness, seemed to point toward one specific purpose, getting him to the galactic core as quickly as possible. It felt less like evolution and more like he was being shaped into a tool for some cosmic purpose he didn't fully understand. "The Umbral know we're coming," reported Thani Moore, the Kethmori communications specialist whose crystalline form had become the fleet's primary sensor array. "Their forces are converging on the core from 17 different vectors. They are bringing everything, harvest ships, void dreadnoughts, and something else. Something so massive it's distorting space-time just by existing." Marcus studied the tactical displays that floated in the bridge's harmonic matrix. The Umbral fleet dwarfed their own by a ratio that made meaningful resistance seem impossible. But then, meaningful resistance had seemed impossible when he'd faced the void arrows, and somehow he'd survived that too. "What about the other refugee fleets?" he asked. "The ones that scattered when we announced our destination?" "Some are trying to establish strongholds in distant systems," Sarathel reported, her colors shifting through patterns of mixed hope and regret. "Others believe we are leading them to certain death and have chosen their own paths. We cannot blame them for their fear." Marcus nodded, understanding the logic even if he regretted the division. Not everyone could make the choice to risk everything on a single desperate gamble, but as he looked around the bridge at the beings who had chosen to come with him, Valdris, Silandri, Boruntai, Kethmori, and representatives from 24 other species, he felt a surge of something that transcended hope. "We're not alone," he said quietly, and the harmonic undertones in his voice carried the statement through the ship's communication network to every member of their fleet. "Whatever happens at the heart, we face it together." The response was immediate and overwhelming. A symphony of agreement in dozens of different alien voices, all harmonizing around the central theme that consciousness was worth defending, regardless of the cost. They dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the galactic core, and Marcus felt his breath catch at the sight before them. The heart of creation wasn't just a place. It was a phenomenon that challenged the basic assumptions of physics. At the center of a swirling maelstrom of energy and matter was something that looked like a star, but behaved like a living thing. It pulsed with rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeats of every conscious being in the galaxy, and its light carried frequencies that spoke directly to the soul. "Beautiful," whispered Lyriavin, who had insisted on joining the mission despite her mother's objections. The young Valdris had become Marcus's closest ally during their journey, and her presence somehow made his own abilities stronger and more focused. "And heavily defended," added Gorthak, the massive Burantai, whose species' natural resistance to exotic energies made him their primary military advisor. "The Umbral have constructed a shell of void platforms around the heart. Any approach will have to go through them. Marcus studied the defensive formations with his enhanced perception, seeing patterns and weaknesses that his original human consciousness never could have detected. The Umbral had indeed built an impressive defense, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed that their enemies would attack like conventional forces, seeking to destroy the platforms through superior firepower. "We're not going to attack them," Marcus said, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. "We're going to transform them." Transform them? Cassandra's Mercury form rippled with confusion. The Umbral are beings of pure entropy. They cannot be changed, only destroyed or avoided. "Everything can be changed," Marcus replied, moving to the ship's harmonic resonance chamber. "They're creatures of void, but void is just the absence of something, not the presence of nothing. If I can fill that absence with consciousness, with choice, with the fundamental patterns that underlie existence." He didn't finish the sentence because he wasn't entirely sure he could do what he was proposing. But as his transformed consciousness reached out toward the heart of creation, he felt something respond. Not the heart itself, but the accumulated presence of every conscious being who had ever lived, ever chosen, ever decided that existence was preferable to non-existence. "The unity frequency," breathed the Queen, who had remained mostly silent during their journey, but now blazed with patterns Marcus had never seen before. "You're going to try to sing them back into existence." "Not just me," Marcus said, settling into the resonance chamber as the ship's systems connected to his enhanced nervous system. "All of us, every species, every individual consciousness in our fleet. If we can harmonize our combined will to exist, we might be able to overcome their collective will to unmake." What followed was the most ambitious attempt at interspecies cooperation in galactic history. Using his abilities as a consciousness translator, Marcus helped coordinate a harmonic symphony that included not just the Allied fleet, but every refugee ship that had chosen to follow them, every survivor of every world the Umbral had attacked, every being who had ever looked into the void and chosen to remain alive. The song they created together was unlike anything the universe had ever heard. It started with Marcus's human determination, the stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had driven his species to survive ice ages and planetary disasters. The Vuldris added their crystal harmonies, frequencies of cooperation and shared consciousness. The Sil Andri contributed flowing melodies of adaptability and change. The Borantai provided deep bass notes of endurance and stability. But it was more than music. It was a declaration of principles, a harmonic manifesto that stated consciousness' claim to existence against the entropy that sought to unmake it. And as the song grew stronger, as more voices joined the cosmic choir, Marcus felt reality itself beginning to respond. The first void platform flickered, its perfect darkness wavering like a candle flame in wind. Then another, and another, as the unity frequency reached frequencies that the Umbral had never encountered before. Where their platforms had been zones of pure negation, spaces began to appear where possibility existed again. "It's working," reported Thanomor, his crystalline form blazing with excitement. "The void platforms are destabilizing. Their structural integrity is dependent on maintaining perfect entropy, but our song is introducing too many variables for them to process." But the Umbral weren't passive observers of their own dissolution. Even as their platforms wavered, they launched a counterattack that was horrifying in its implications. They began to sing back. The Umbral song was the opposite of everything Marcus's alliance had created. Where their harmony spoke of unity, the Umbral anti-melody preached division. Where they sang of hope, the enemy sang of despair. Where they chose existence, the Umbral chose the peace of non-being. And it was incredibly seductive. Marcus felt the pull of it immediately. The promise that all struggle could end, all pain could cease. All difficult choices could be avoided by simply choosing not to be. It would be so easy to stop fighting, to let the darkness take away the burden of consciousness, the weight of choice, the responsibility of existence. Around him he could sense other members of the Alliance wavering. The Kethmori, with their mathematical precision, were calculating the statistical impossibility of victory. The Salandri were considering the elegant simplicity of entropy over the messy complexity of life. Even some of the Vuldris were beginning to dim, their crystal forms losing coherence as they contemplated the attractiveness of non-existence. "Hold the harmony," Marcus called out, pushing more of himself into the unity frequency, using his transformed consciousness as an anchor for the others. "Remember what you're fighting for. But even as he spoke, he could feel his own resolve beginning to waver. The umbral song was too perfect, too complete in its negation of everything he believed in. It promised not just death, but the complete absence of death. The state where death was unnecessary because existence had never happened in the first place. That was when Lyriavan saved them all. The young Valdres princess had been quiet throughout most of the battle, adding her voice to the harmony but not taking a leadership role. But as the alliance began to crumble under the weight of the umbral anti-song, she suddenly blazed brighter than Marcus had ever seen her. "I remember," she said, her voice cutting through both melodies with crystalline clarity. "I remember Marcus stepping in front of the arrows. I remember choosing to live when it would have been easier to die. I remember that consciousness isn't just about existing, it's about choosing to exist for others." Her words sparked something in Marcus, a memory of why he had made his original choice. Not because existence was easy or pleasant or guaranteed, but because there were others who needed protection, others whose consciousness was worth preserving even at the cost of his own. He poured that realization into the unity frequency, and it spread through the alliance like wildfire. The Borentai remembered their children learning to speak for the first time. The Silandri remembered the beauty of transformation and growth. The Keth Mori remembered the elegant perfection of a mathematical proof that revealed new truths about reality. One by one, the alliance members found their reasons to exist, their individual motivations for choosing consciousness over void. And as they did, their combined song began to overwhelm the umbral anti-melody. The effect on the void platforms was immediate and dramatic. Instead of simply destabilizing, they began to transform, their perfect darkness giving way to regions of space where possibility existed again. Where umbral creatures had been manifestations of pure entropy, new forms began to appear, beings that retained the aliens' power over space and time but had chosen existence over void. "Impossible!" came a voice from the largest umbral ship, speaking in harmonics that carried pain and confusion. "We are perfection. We are the end of all struggle. How can you choose suffering over peace?" Marcus reached out with his consciousness, trying to understand the being that had spoken. What he found surprised him, not a creature of pure evil, but something that had once been conscious, once been individual, but had chosen to surrender that individuality to escape the pain of existence. "Because suffering means we're alive," Marcus replied, his words carrying through space on harmonic frequencies that reached every ship in both fleets. "Because consciousness isn't about avoiding pain, it's about choosing what kind of pain is worth enduring, and protecting others, caring for others, fighting for others, that's a pain worth any price." The silence that followed was profound, stretching across space like a held breath. Then, incredibly, some of the umbral ships began to change. Not many, perhaps 1 in 50, but enough to prove that even beings of pure entropy could choose differently when presented with an alternative. The remaining umbral forces, faced with defection in their own ranks and the continued collapse of their defensive platforms, made a strategic withdrawal. But as they retreated, their leader, a massive construct that seemed to be made of crystallized void itself, sent one final message.
"This is not over, Star-Touched."
"We withdraw now, but we will return with forces you cannot imagine. And when we do, we will not make the mistake of giving you the choice to resist." As the umbral fleet disappeared into the spaces between spaces, Marcus felt both victory and foreboding. They had won this battle, proven that consciousness could resist entropy when unified by common purpose. But the war was far from over. "The heart," Zarathel said urgently, pointing toward the galactic core where the pulsing star-like entity waited. "With the platforms gone, we can approach it directly, but we must hurry. The umbral will return, and when they do, they will bring forces designed specifically to counter what we have learned to do." Marcus nodded, but as their fleet moved toward the heart of creation, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking toward his own end. Every step of this journey had transformed him further from human towards something else, and he suspected that whatever waited at the heart would complete that transformation. The question was whether what he became would still be enough like Marcus Chen to remember why consciousness was worth preserving. As they approached the pulsing heart of the galaxy, Marcus felt his consciousness expanding, connecting not just with his allies, but with the fundamental forces that held reality together. And in that expansion, he began to understand what the final choice would really mean. He would have to choose between remaining Marcus Chen and becoming something that could protect consciousness itself from the forces that sought to unmake it. Between staying individual and becoming universal. Between being human and becoming hope itself. The heart of creation pulsed ahead of them, waiting for his decision. The heart of creation was nothing like Marcus had expected. As their ship approached the pulsing core of the galaxy, he had prepared himself for some kind of technological construct, or perhaps a natural phenomenon, like a massive star or black hole. Instead, what he found was something that challenged the very concept of physical existence. The heart was alive, not in any biological sense, but in the way that consciousness itself was alive. It pulsed with rhythms that corresponded to every thinking moment in the galaxy, every choice made by every sentient being. As Marcus reached out with his enhanced senses, he realized that the heart wasn't just at the center of the galaxy. It was the center, the focal point around which all consciousness orbited. "It's beautiful," whispered Lyria Veen, her crystalline form blazing with colors Marcus had never seen before. "I can feel every thought, every dream, every moment of wonder that any being has ever experienced. And every moment of despair, every surrender, every choice to stop fighting," added Cassandra, her mercury form rippling with complex emotions. "The heart holds all of consciousness, not just the parts we find comfortable." Marcus nodded, understanding what she meant. As they drew closer to the heart, he could feel the full spectrum of conscious experience washing over him in waves. Joy and sorrow, hope and despair, love and hatred, all of it swirling together in patterns too complex for any individual mind to fully process. "Marcus," came the Queen's voice, heavy with harmonics of destiny and farewell. "The prophecies are clear about what happens next. To interface with the heart directly, to gain the power to protect consciousness against the Umbral's final unmaking, you must surrender your individual identity entirely. You will become part of the heart itself, a guardian consciousness that exists to protect all others." Marcus felt the weight of that choice settling over him like a shroud. Everything he was, everything he remembered, about being human, about being Marcus Chen the engineer, all of it would be dissolved into something larger, something that served the needs of universal consciousness rather than individual desires. "There might be another way," Thanemore said suddenly, his crystalline form flickering with rapid calculations. "The mathematical models suggest that consciousness can maintain individual identity while joining a collective structure if the bond is formed through voluntary choice rather than forced integration." "You're suggesting a merger rather than absorption," Marcus said, understanding immediately. "Like the way our alliances worked, different voices contributing to a single harmony while maintaining their individual characteristics?" "Precisely. But it would require perfect trust between you and the heart, perfect willingness to share everything while giving up nothing essential." Thanemore paused, his pattern shifting to concern. "And it has never been attempted before. The risk of losing yourself entirely might actually be greater than traditional integration." Marcus looked around at the beings who had followed him on this impossible journey. Valdri, Silandri, Borintai, Kethmori, and dozens of other species, all